Forget everything you thought you knew about the end of Saitama vs. Garou. There is a new version of the latest chapter out that changes pretty much everything. Instead of this conflict wrapping up with Saitama and Garou casually talking things out, things take a much crazier turn. Again, we would see some of our A-class heroes with the former hostage Waganma in tow, as Tatario having snuck away for the sake of urging Garou against the path of evil. Lightning Max would make a push for those of them who could still move to head back to shore and search for the kid. However, Waganma would shift everyone's focus by way of his fearful outcry on account of what they all initially perceived to be a drowned corpse, presumably having become bloated on account of the excess water exposure. Believing this to be a civilian that failed to evacuate the area in time, the group would express their sadness and pay their respects. However, it would not be long before the supposed corpse would flip over and reveal himself to not only still be among the living, but also as the S-class hero, Pig God, which certainly surprised them. Meanwhile, this is probably the least surprising portion of the chapter. From here, we would shift to Garou as he sprouted his additional arms and cried out in his frustration. This would then be followed up with a raging blitz of rapid fists aimed at our bald hero of a main character. Saitama would easily handle these attacks, all while maintaining a smile on his face as he'd compliment this latest attempt and furthermore question where Garou learned to do such a neat trick. Not really impressed, but more so amused. This of course only pissed Garou off more as he considered the fact that he was supposed to become the embodiment of absolute evil. And after he took down Sage Centipede, he was pretty confident in the fact that he had already obtained the power necessary to properly fulfill such a role. However, this one man has changed everything for him. This frustration would grow even further once Saitama urged him to just give up as he swatted away this innumerable cluster of fists with only one hand. And after this display, Saitama began to fall downwards, questioning if Garou was done yet, completely trivializing everything he was and could ever hope to be. Now, this reworking of events surely paints Garou in a far more aggressive and serious light, as opposed to what is by comparison a far more embarrassing and or shameful display of failure that we had witnessed with the original incarnation of the chapter, and arguably some to come before it. Garou here in this case was presented to be absolutely infuriated by the situation, but was certainly willing to let it become the strength he needed to overcome this final challenge. He refused to let go of his anger until all of humanity was made to suffer the very same pain and despair as he had. A presentation of his ideals and dream that gives far less room for any underlying good. Furthermore, he would recall the recent events of their clash and how grateful those office workers he had inadvertently saved were. He would consider the fact that that simple gesture was actually enough to cause him to waver on his path. He considered this to be pathetic of him and was really pissed off because of it, as he concentrated a great deal of energy into his upper set of fists. And upon hearing the thoughts of some webcomic fans, I believe there are people out there who felt similarly. So hopefully if you're in that camp, this rerouting of his character is to your liking. Let us know down below. Speaking of which, Garou would surge down with this power, propelling both himself and Saitama. Garou's blood at this point was practically boiling on account of Saitama mocking him, as he sought to punish the hero for it, thereby plunging Saitama into a nearby mountain and inverting it, pushing further and further into the depths of the earth along with him, the impact of which would be the cause of reverberations that could be felt on the opposite side of the globe, a location which coincidentally enough, there was a class of Japanese children on an international flight that was in the midst of sinking into the depths of the ocean. These kids were understandably in a panic and would begin to question why no hero nor any rescue team had come to save them just yet. Furthermore, they had some pretty awful adults in their midst that prioritized their individual safety over those of the children they had been entrusted to oversee. However, suddenly, thanks to the force created by Garou, the environment would forever be changed as previously submerged land masses would begin to surface, as subsequently, Garou has inadvertently saved many lives yet again, the likes of which were entirely mystified and bewildered to the point of being unable to speak. Although in the background would be some peculiar structures, so dabbling into that at some point in the future is sure to be fascinating. And speaking of fascinating, in another dimension, we would have the likes of Blast and his comrades recognizing the oddities of Earth's gravitational and magnetic fields, by extension causing spatial distortion that was able to create a hole in the so-called dimensional seal. It would then be emphasized that God was bound to break through at this rate and that they would need to repair it. What is ultimately a very simplified and far more ambiguous version of the contents we received from the initial version. What at this point one may consider to be spoilers for what is likely to still be the case in the future. I for one certainly find this change to be peculiar, but it is certainly not a deal breaker considering all that is still left to come. And hey, if you'd like to keep up with One Punch Man beyond this chapter, be sure to drop a like on the video and subscribe to Plot Armor with notifications on, so you can say you've been here since before 500,000. From there, we would make our way back to the continuation of Saitama vs. Garou, as in the midst of being plunged deeper and deeper, Saitama would shoot Garou a rather unimpressed look, that lacked the patience to entertain this any longer. With this, Saitama would retaliate with consecutive normal punches. He would pummel the wannabe monster several times in the depths before rocketing out of the crater as he continued to do so. There was seemingly no end to the fists assailing Garou. He had tried everything he could possibly think of to do against Saitama, but his efforts were futile. He could not concoct a single way in which he could win against this hero. At this point, Garou would recall the words of the late-stage centipede upon his initial appearance, that his purpose for emerging at all was for the sake of destroying the so-called abominable fist that has turned against God. What Garou at the time believed to be in reference to himself. However, it was now abundantly clear that in reality, Saitama was the one being referred to, as his fist met Garou's kite in his face. A punch which would send Garou a great distance away, crashing straight through an entire mountain range, and furthermore hitting the water with such speeds that he'd skip from point to point before finally being left collapsed and partially submerged. Garou would go on to breathe heavily, attempting to catch his breath, as Saitama would now be able to truly descend. Garou would again look at the imposing visage of Cape Baldi and wonder what in the world his opponent was. As from there, interestingly enough, he would equate the man to being akin to the embodiment of unfairness, as his visage would then be likened to those of his silhouetted childhood bullies, as yeah, there is no questioning nor denying it. Saitama, with how ridiculously powerful as he is bullying Garou and his inferior strength at this point, and for him to be as strong as he stood to be was downright unfair. Saitama is not playing the same game as everyone else inherently. This bothered Garou in a whole new way as he'd force himself back onto his feet and slowly rise up from the water before rushing the hero yet again, stating that there was no way he would allow himself to lose to such a person while pulling back a fist with every intention to turn the tide here. But this is where things really begin to get crazy. Instead of grabbing hold of Garou's fist like he had in the previous version, this rework Saitama is far more savage and just outright punch Garou yet again. However, this time, in doing so, the monstrous exoskeleton of Garou would begin to break apart and fade. Yet his frustration would not fade or subside. As the human body of Garou would be released from the monstrous hold of his more bulky exterior, he'd find himself disillusioned with such a reality where, after going through all that he has to reach the pinnacle, presents before him the embodiment of unbeatable unfairness to end it all. And all while this was happening, something was in the midst of forming, as we would then receive an expanded shot of the environment with the words, "I can hear you" present, as something would begin to catch Saitama's attention. However, elsewhere, we would have all the folks Pig God had within his stomach be released, many of which were still unconscious. Moomin Rider and the Tank Top Gang would be very happy to see Tank Top Master, and the feeling was mutual. He would then ask them if they had snuck out of the hospital to be there. But despite being happy to see him, the collective would be at a loss for words on account of his newfound outwardly appearance. Yet Tank Top Master wasn't so sure why they had suddenly become so quiet. But just then, something would catch the attention of Lightning Max as he would alert all those around him. There, they would all observe a pretty bizarre looking cloud. This would be followed by a major flash of light, what would ultimately be the dimensional invasion of God, as one of his titanic feet would emerge from this cloud-based portal as lightning struck all around it. Things are getting real. The heroes present would now all be mystified by this phenomenon, as yet another cloud would form behind it, doing the very same as God continued to puncture their world. However, it would seem as though the visuals of God himself for everyone in attendance was absent. This being the case for the larger group of heroes, and for Saitama, as he'd simply remarked that this was a weird thundercloud. All the while, as Garou hurtled through the air, God would continue his approach, this time being more present in the world than ever before. Therefore, presumably capable of far more providence, the likes of which was enough to endow the likes of a simple homeless man with the power to be a threat-level dragon adversary, when the visage of God was merely composed of a few aberrant lines. God would now call to Garou by name. As Garou continued through the sky, he questioned who was communicating with him. The mysterious entity would respond that the boy's greatest desire was on the precipice of collapse into impossibility on account of a single hero, a comment that touched upon Garou's frustration and provoked him towards physical retaliation. This insolence would be ignored, as God would then offer a statement followed by a question. There was only one fist that could counter the fist that is turned against God, then asking him what he believed that might be. Garou was confused by this conversation and would again question the identity of the one speaking to him, commanding them to show themselves, as then a vaguely familiar silhouette would appear and chuckle, then saying they were just trying to help him out. Garou would then turn to them and believe this to be his former Master Bang. The opportunistic entity would then respond by saying that there was no master who could just sit back and idly watch as their student is beaten, enacting a ploy similar to the one attempted on Tatsumaki previously. God, with the appearance of Bang, would tell Garou to accept him while extending its hand, and unfortunately, Garou for once would accept help and be taken advantage of. Garou has now been endowed with the providence of God, a prospect which we theorize will perhaps come to fruition during our collaboration video with Mastar Media in regards to this very Saitama versus Garou fight. And all while this stuff was happening, Saitama would look up to the dark sky above, then knowing that something was coming. As he continued to look upwards and onwards, there would be an impact in the water behind him. Yet again, it was Garou, back to his more humanoid form, yet ferocious all the same, seemingly newly enriched. Saitama would call out to him, but was confused. He then questioned the fact that Garou had changed costumes yet again, although something was off here. Saitama's expression would change as he would then rub his eyes to get a better look, squinting for the sake of being able to properly see Garou, who was still hunched over and somewhat obscured by the darkness of night. As we would then get up close and personal to this new look, which was faceless like his divine benefactor, as several galaxies and stars littered his form. Saitama was concerned and wondered what was wrong with the guy's face. The previous question proposed by God would then be answered by this new Garou, that the thing that could counter the fist that is turned against God would have to be the very fist of God itself. Saitama was confused and would express that it sounded like Garou was talking in a bathroom or something on account of how especially muffled his voice was. This new Garou would then begin to make use of the now ever iconic water stream rock smashing fist he had learned from his Master Bang, all the while gesturing his way towards his adversary, ultimately culminating in a shot that would announce this to be Awaken Garou, Cosmic Fear Mode. The unadulterated power of the cosmos was very much at his disposal. God seems to be especially familiar with Saitama, considering the designation of him being a fist that is turned. So if Garou is assumed to now be such a fist himself, I can't help but be curious as to how this is going to turn out, or at least how it's going to go over the course of its duration. It's somewhat hard to imagine that narratively Saitama will be able to immediately dismiss this threat, but then again, it's Saitama we're talking about. This is what he does. So I, for one, am very excited to see the furtherance of all of this. Sadly for Garou, he has been denied his happy ending of potentially sound mental health, but it is what it is, and we now have much more epic events to look forward to. As always, I'm Sliceable Otaku. Thank you all so much for watching and have an awesome day. I love you.